The map room at Fort Benning smelled like old coffee and older arguments. Not the kind of arguments that end with handshakes, but the kind that get buried in reports, filed in triplicate, and resurrected years later as either proof of genius or evidence of madness, depending on who won in the meantime. The walls were covered in overlapping maps of Europe, North Africa, theoretical battlefields that existed only on paper and in the imaginations of men who hadn't yet been asked to prove their theories with other people's lives. It was September of 1941, and the United States Army was still deciding what kind of war it intended to fight. General Walter Hargrove had been in the Army for 31 years. He carried those years the way some men carry money, with a quiet but absolute confidence in their weight. He was tall, spare, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material as the institution he served, hard, angular, permanently set in an expression that communicated above all else that he had seen enough of the world to no longer be surprised by most of it. He had served in the Philippines, had helped organize supply chains in the First World War from a desk in Paris, and had spent the years since building a career on the bedrock conviction that wars were won by infantry, by men on the ground who took and held territory with their feet and their rifles, and the particular kind of stubbornness that only face-to-face combat could produce, and only face-to-face combat could defeat. He believed in artillery as support, he believed in cavalry as reconnaissance, and he believed, with the certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything he considered settled, that the tank was a useful but fundamentally limited instrument, a support weapon, not a war winner, a tool that served the infantry rather than one that could operate as its own decisive force. George Patton had been listening to variations of this argument for nearly 3 years. He was standing at the far end of the map table when Hargrove came in, studying the terrain model of Libya that the intelligence section had assembled the week prior. He was wearing his tanker's jacket over his dress uniform, which was itself a statement, though Patton would have denied making statements with clothing while making one at every possible opportunity. He was 56 years old, and he looked like someone had taken the concept of forward momentum and given it a human form. Broad through the chest, direct in the eye, with a jaw that seemed designed specifically to push through resistance. He had 2 ivory-handled revolvers on his hips that some people thought were theatrical, and that he thought were practical, and that were, in fact, both. He'd been summoned to this meeting because his memo on armored doctrine had circulated through the War Department and landed on the desks of people who found it either visionary or alarming, depending on their starting position. The memo had argued, in Patton's characteristic style, which was to say directly, colorfully, and with complete indifference to diplomatic hedging, that the emerging doctrine of tank warfare being developed by the Germans represented an entirely new kind of military problem, one that could not be solved by traditional answers. It had argued that armored units needed to operate with the independence and depth of advance that cavalry had once operated with, not in support of infantry, but ahead of it, through it, past it, driving into the enemy's rear before the enemy understood the front had moved. Hargrove set his briefcase on the table without looking at Patton directly. It was a way of communicating priority. Then he looked at him. "George," he said, and in that single word was contained everything he intended to follow it with: the weight of seniority, the patience of a man who has corrected younger men many times before, the measured disappointment of an institution confronting an enthusiast. "Walter," Patton said, with equal economy and entirely different content. Hargrove pulled a chair and sat. He opened his briefcase and removed a copy of the memo, which had been marked in several places with pencil annotations. He placed it on the table and smoothed it flat with one hand, a gesture that managed to combine orderliness with contempt. "I've read this 3 times, he said. "I'm honored." "Don't be. I read it 3 times because I kept waiting for the part where it became a serious military proposal rather than an adventure story." He tapped the top page. "Independent armored advances, deep penetration, bypassing defended positions, letting infantry catch up later." He looked up. "George, this isn't doctrine. This is a cavalry officer's fantasy dressed up in mechanical language." Patton walked around the table to the chair closest to the terrain model and sat in it backwards, arms folded across the top of the backrest. It was not the posture of a man receiving a correction. "The Germans did it in France," he said. "The French weren't prepared. The Poles weren't either. Norway wasn't. The Low Countries weren't." A pause. "There seems to be a pattern developing in who isn't prepared." Hargrove's expression didn't change because it rarely did. "The Germans succeeded in France because of specific conditions: air superiority, surprise, an opponent whose doctrine was already 40 years behind. Those conditions won't repeat themselves. They won't have surprise again, and they won't always have air superiority. He leaned forward slightly. Your tanks, George. Your beautiful tanks. Tell me what happens to your beautiful independent armored advance when it runs into prepared defensive positions with anti-tank guns. Tell me what happens when it outpaces its supply lines. Tell me what happens when it operates without infantry to hold what it takes. These were not stupid questions. That was part of what made this conversation difficult. Hargrove was not a fool. He was a man with a coherent worldview built on decades of genuine experience, and the questions he was asking were real questions with partial answers that required the kind of faith in emerging evidence that institutions found very difficult to manufacture. A tank running into a prepared anti-tank position is a strategic failure, not a tactical one, Patton said. If your tank is running into a prepared position, your intelligence failed, or your speed failed, or both. The answer isn't to slow down. The answer is to move faster and deeper than they can prepare for. That's reckless. That's the point. Patton stood and moved to the map pinned on the wall behind him, the overview of European theater. He didn't point immediately. He let the map speak for a moment, let its scale establish the terms of what he was about to say. Walter, I have enormous respect for what you know. What you know is real and it has value. But what you know comes from a war where the front was a line, and victory meant advancing that line, and the instruments of war were optimized for attrition. His finger came up and traced a path that moved not along the front, but through it, curving behind, cutting supply lines, isolating positions. This war doesn't have a front the same way, or rather, the front becomes irrelevant the moment you're behind it. The question isn't whether tanks can hold ground. The question is whether tanks can make the ground the enemy is holding worthless before the enemy realizes what's happened. Hargrove watched the finger move on the map. He was a career soldier, and career soldiers watch movements on maps whether they want to or not. That's a theory, he said. Everything is a theory until someone does it. The Germans, I'm not talking about the Germans as an example to copy. I'm talking about them as proof of principle. Patton turned from the map. You say my tanks will never win this war. I'm telling you that whether they do or don't depends entirely on whether we let them fight as tanks or force them to fight as infantry support weapons. In the first role, they represent something that has never existed before in warfare. In the second, they're expensive and vulnerable replacements for artillery that cost 3 times as much to build and maintain. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He looked at the memo, then at the map, then at Patton. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, still firm, still skeptical, but with something that was trying to be honest about the limits of its own certainty. I've watched you with those machines, George. I know you believe in them. I know you've read everything there is to read about how the Germans use them. And I'm not saying armored units have no role. He paused. I'm saying the role you're describing, this independent, deep penetration, war-winning role, it's never been proven. Not in conditions that will resemble what we face. Not against a prepared enemy who knows it's coming and has had time to think about how to answer it. Then let me prove it, Patton said simply. The simplicity of it sat in the room for a moment. You're asking for operational command of an armored exercise. I'm asking for operational command of an armored exercise designed to test independent deep penetration doctrine against a conventionally organized opposition force. 2 weeks in the Louisiana countryside. Real terrain, real logistics challenges, real opposition, and at the end of it, real data. Patton moved back to the table and picked up the memo. I'm not asking you to believe the theory, Walter. I'm asking you to give the theory a controlled opportunity to fail. If it fails, you'll have evidence, not just argument. If it doesn't fail, he set the memo down. Then you'll have something more valuable than either of our opinions. Hargrove looked at him for a long time. The kind of looking that was actually thinking, and that honest men do when they're trying to separate what they believe from what they know, and finding the line between them harder to draw than they expected. 7 days, Hargrove said finally. The Louisiana maneuvers phase begins in 7 days. You'll have the 2nd Armored Division. He held up a hand because Patton was already beginning to respond. You'll have them for the duration of the exercise phase, against General Ben Lear's 2nd Army, which has 5 times your infantry, and has been planning their defensive doctrine specifically in response to the kind of advance you're proposing. He looked at him steadily. If your tanks can't prove their case against a prepared, numerically superior opposition in a controlled exercise, George, then they certainly won't prove it in France. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand that you're giving me an opportunity. I'm giving you the rope to hang this theory with, so we can stop having this conversation and start planning the war we're actually going to fight." Patton picked up his cover from the end of the table with a movement that concluded things. 7 days, he said. He left, and in the corridor outside the map room, he stopped for exactly the length of time it took to look at the building across the parade ground where the 2nd Armored had its command post, and then he started walking toward it with the particular stride of a man who has already, in every meaningful sense, begun. What followed in those 7 days is the kind of thing that military historians write about with the sobriety of science, and that the men who lived through it remember with the electricity of myth. Patton covered 400 miles in 48 hours, not 400 miles of straight road, 400 miles of Louisiana terrain, of river crossings that weren't supposed to be fordable and that his engineers decided were fordable anyway, of roadblocks that his lead elements went around rather than through, of supply lines that stretched past every established parameter of sustainable advance and held because Patton had pre-positioned fuel trucks in patterns that looked improvised and were actually the result of weeks of logistics planning that nobody had asked to see. General Lear's 2nd Army, 5 times the size, prepared, dug in, organized along lines designed specifically to blunt exactly this kind of advance, found itself attempting to hold a front that kept not being where they'd placed it. The theory that tanks had to be stopped by prepared anti-tank positions depended on the tanks being where the anti-tank positions expected them to be. Patton's tanks were somewhere else. They were in the rear. They were at the supply depots. They were at the road junctions that the map said were behind the front and that were therefore, according to traditional doctrine, safe. They weren't safe. The exercise umpires, responsible for scoring the theoretical casualties and territorial gains, began using phrases in their reports that they hadn't used before. Phrases like strategic dislocation and command paralysis. And, in one memorable late-night evaluation, the opposing force has ceased to exist as a coherent operational unit. In 7 days, against 5 times the numbers. Hargrove received the preliminary results on the 6th evening. He was in his office at Fort Benning with 2 colonels who had been running the independent assessment, and he read the summary sheet twice before he spoke. "He didn't just win," one of the colonels said carefully. "I can see that. He won in a way that the opposition couldn't respond to. Every time they adjusted their line to address his position, he had already moved past the position they were adjusting to address." Hargrove set the summary down. He stood and walked to the window and looked at the dark parade ground outside for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt longer to the colonels behind him. When he turned back, his expression had done something that it very rarely did. It had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible in a photograph, but in the way that a man's face changes when he is requiring himself to update something fundamental about his understanding of the world, when the evidence has crossed a threshold he had privately set for it, and that he has decided to honor. "Get Patton on the phone in the morning," he said. He said nothing else about it that evening, but the following week, at the post-exercise debrief attended by 37 senior officers, Hargrove made a statement that was recorded in the official Army account and that nobody who was present forgot. He said that the Louisiana maneuvers had demonstrated, under controlled conditions as rigorous as any field exercise the Army had conducted, that independently operated armored forces could achieve strategic results at operational tempos that traditional doctrine had no framework to address, defend against, or intellectually anticipate. He did not say that he had been wrong. Hargrove was not that kind of man. But he said that the doctrine required revision, and in a room full of Army officers in 1941, that sentence meant exactly the same thing. Patton was at the end of the table during this debrief, and those who watched him closely enough said that he showed very little visible reaction. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the expression of a man who had been told he was right and wanted to make sure everyone registered it. He looked like a man who was already thinking about what came next. Because for Patton, the theory was never really the point. The theory was just the gate you had to open before you could get to the actual work. And the actual work involved real armies, real opponents, real ground, and a war that was moving toward the United States, whether or not the United States had finished arguing about how to fight it. He had spent 3 years trying to open the gate. In 11 months, North Africa would open it for real. And when the Second Corps crossed into Tunisia in early 1943, inheriting a demoralized force after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, and Patton arrived to command it, the officers who received him remembered the leather jacket and the ivory revolvers and the particular quality of forward urgency that seemed to travel with him like weather. Within 2 weeks, the Corps had reorganized. Within 3, it was advancing again. Within 6, the Germans in North Africa were finished. Not because of any single battle, not because of any single decision, but because Patton had spent the years before the war arguing for a way of thinking about armor that the army had eventually, grudgingly, incompletely accepted, and because in North Africa and later in Sicily and later across France, he had been given enough room to demonstrate what that thinking actually looked like when it was freed from committees and doctrine debates and the institutional weight of 30 generals who had excellent reasons to believe that what they knew was enough. General Hargrove watched the North Africa campaign from Washington. He was on the Joint Planning Staff by then, working on logistics for the Pacific Theater. He followed the reports from Tunisia the way men follow news of something they were tangentially responsible for, with the complicated feeling of partial ownership over an outcome they couldn't entirely take credit for and weren't entirely sure they deserved. One of his staff officers, young, recently arrived from West Point, asked him once what he thought of Patton's methods, the relentlessness of the advance, the willingness to push past supply margins that made the logistics people in Washington genuinely nervous. Hargrove was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was being precise. "I thought armor couldn't win a war," he said. "I had reasons for that belief. The reasons weren't wrong exactly. They were just built from evidence that hadn't accounted for what happens when you commit completely to speed as a weapon in itself." A pause. Patton understood something that took the rest of us longer to see. That when you move fast enough, the enemy's plan doesn't fail because you defeated it. It fails because it was written for a battle that had already ended by the time they picked up their pen. The young officer nodded, trying to absorb this. Hargrove looked back at his reports. "Don't make the mistake of thinking he was reckless," he said. "Reckless men don't plan fuel depots. Reckless men don't study logistics tables at midnight. What he was?" And here he stopped, finding the right word with the care of a man who had learned to value accuracy above comfort, was committed. Completely and without reservation committed to a theory of war that he had worked out from evidence, not from instinct. The difference matters. He picked up his pen. Instinct runs out. Evidence doesn't. He went back to his work. Outside, somewhere in the organization of the building, someone was on the telephone with North Africa, reading coordinates, translating the advancing lines of Patton's progress into the language of official record. The lines kept moving forward.